The truth of the matter in the garden was the elevation of human beings, not to the companionship of God, because that was our purpose, but it was to the elevation of the status of being God.
Right.
And so pride is the cardinal, or the seminal, I should say, seminal sin from which all other sins, the desire for sex, the desire for money.
That's right. How I usually say it is, if there was an Olympics of stupid misbehavior motives, and there was a gold and medal and a medal platform, that platform would be called pride, and on that platform would stand these three, and the silver and the bronze would probably be sex and money, in one of those orders you can decide for yourself. But the gold medalist is the pursuit of power, and it's in that category of pursuit of power that celebrity resides. Yeah, you're absolutely right. As it turns out, that any worldview in which that's meritorious, where you like a meritocracy, where you earn something, that leads to pride. It's just the nature. That's why I don't know if I put it in this book or I just talk about it publicly. Our friend Mike Adams, who's no longer with us, he used to always tease that he wrote this book, How to Become Humble in 10 Easy Steps, and how I made it in 8. Right? So we all laugh at that. But his point is valid, is that you cannot pursue humility, because the pursuit itself becomes a prideful pursuit. Anything in which you can earn, for example, the highest thing that your God offers, or you can earn a status before God, so it turns out you'd have to have a system in which it's nothing you could do, but instead it's been given to you as a free gift so that no one can boast. Okay, that is the antidote to this kind of silliness, and that's why the Christian worldview just happens to get right, and it's the only view that happens to get right, because every other theistic view and even secular views all involve a transactional relationship, either with the culture or a transactional relationship with God. I will do this, you do that. I do this, I get that. And this is how all of life seems to be, right? Except for this worldview that happens to it's on its head, and it happens to get the one thing right that leads to human flourishing at the highest rate. So that could be a coincidence, or it might just be that God's trying to tell us something about our design and how we could flourish, and he's offered us the one way. But you know, and I know that most of us don't think deeply about our Christian worldview. We don't think deeply about what it offers. We don't think so. We can call ourselves Christians and do no better in this area than anybody else. And I certainly have been that kind of guy. And it's because I'm not focusing. You know, it's not a coincidence that Paul says you'll be transformed by the renewal of your efforts, or the renewal of your will, or the renewal of your desires or your emotions. No, it's the renewal of your mind. And so my problem is that I don't stay focused very long. I think that's probably true for all of us.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, and before I move on from this, because just a couple of things spring to mind. One thing is, and throughout the book you talk about we were made for, we were built for, we were designed for worship and community and relationships and friendships, and all this stuff, which is very, very true. And the Bible talks about this, and the data that's out there shows that what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years, we now have confirmed, either through experiment, through studies and whatever. So that leads to the credibility. But there is this universal, I think, desire for this, even when we try to find things in the wrong place. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I've often quoted this. It's in one of my books as well. It comes from the Imam Ali. Now, Imam Ali for the Shia Muslims is like there's Muhammad and there's Imam Ali, just slightly below him. And for a lot of Muslims all over the world, he's considered a huge influence. Now, he's got a book. I don't think he titled it. I hope he didn't title it, because it's not the most humble title. It's called The Peak of Eloquence, which is not exactly a humble title, but he has this sermon. It's a collection of a bunch of his sermons, and I think it's Sermon 88, where he says this. This is interesting. This is a Muslim talking. Okay. He says, among the believers there are three. There are those who worship God to attain his heaven. That is the worship of the merchant. There are those who worship God to avoid his hell. That is the worship of the slave. But there are those who worship God out of gratitude. That is the worship of the free and the noble. And what's interesting about that is, in a works-based system like Islam, you're either a merchant or you're a slave. Because you're trying to earn something, and then at some point you become a slave even to your own pride. Like, give me, you owe it to me, which is what Paul talks about, is that no one should be able to boast from this. And so there's this inherent recognition, as fallen as the recognition is, there is a recognition that we need to understand a spiritual discipline or a spiritual reality that is rooted in an idea that you can't earn it because it'll lead to slavery or sort of a merchant form of worship. But a free and noble worship is not a worship that's born of pride, of pride in your own freedom, of your own nobility, but in gratitude. So I really appreciate what you have to say there, because I can see that universally speaking as well. And the other thing that comes to mind is a quote by John Lennox. I remember, John Lennox, the mathematician and Bible teacher. He had this way about him where he could do these couplings, and they just pop off of his mouth like going out of style. I remember him doing a talk, and he was doing a Q&A with some people in a very closed setting, so it wasn't a big stage thing. And he's to a bunch of apologists and people who were looking to do something with their apologetics in various forms of ministry. And he said, "We are encouraged to use our mind and trust God. And the temptation of apologetics is to do the opposite, is to trust our mind and use God. And that way God becomes the hustle." And I think that's something that all of us, I don't know if you're an apologist, I don't know if you're a minister at a church, I don't know what the deal is with you in your Christian walk or your non-Christian walk, because a lot of non-Christians will tune in. I think there's some wisdom there into you trusting your mind more than you ought, and using God as a dodge or a hustle without realizing it. That's why, not to brag about the ministry, but one of the things we try to strive for is to build a kingdom, not castles, and uphold people, not platforms. Because if you go for platform, you'll crush people. If you go for people, God will give you whatever platform is necessary to not destroy you, as long as you keep those things in check. So, yeah. Derek, you have a question, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, too, there is this wonderful quote from, because we've talked a lot about legacy, and there's this wonderful quote. It's attributed to the early reformer Nicholas von Zinzendorf, which was the 6 words to guide your life: preach, hold on, let me think about it. Oh, yeah. Okay, I've got it. Zach,
God is trying to make you humble here as you try to recall these 6 things.
6 things. It's like that when who was it? The governor of Texas was like, "Here's the 3 things I would take away from the government if I was elected president," and he could only think of 2. And oops, and that was the end of his campaign.
Exactly.
Rick Perry, I think. Anyway, it was 6 words: preach the gospel, die, be forgotten. And that's what he thought about legacy. And it's interesting to me, because then if that's how you live your life, there's nothing wrong with remembering people who set good examples.
Sure.
And that's the best example that it seems like you can set. So actually, by not seeking after your legacy, your own legacy, you create this better legacy than you are. It's much better to remember someone like that. And so those are really good. But I did want to just shift a little bit to talk about, actually, for a bit, just this phenomenon of true crime. And I know I mentioned my wife earlier, and it kind of ties in actually a little bit to Abdu's last book as well, which was More Than a White Man's Religion, that talked about race and gender, and specifically the gender issue. Because what I've noticed is, as I've sort of been on this journey with my wife, who, by the way, is very, very jealous today. Rarely is she jealous about most of the things I do, but talking to a cold case detective, she's, now she's interested. So,
well, good. And we've been trying to leverage that for a while, only because there's a lot of people, especially cops, who are more likely to hear the gospel from one of their own. I guess, I think that's probably still true. So that's obviously a group I'm trying to reach. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see that. And but what I've noticed this interesting phenomenon. There seems to be this sisterhood that has formed around true crime, and these little groups that get together, look out for each other, and it really is this. It's almost a lot of them are being sort of trained on how to avoid being hurt by strangers, and essentially they're trying to. Stop yourself from being victims of fall. We can again take it back to that. They are recognizing there is a problem. You can't trust people, and so how do we do it? Because we are the most vulnerable. And I remember when I first got with my wife, and learning that for women, and this was like a revelation to me, which maybe I was stupid, but for women, you can't just go on a hike in the woods alone. To me, that's nothing. To a woman, that's a frightening endeavor. Right. And there are all these stories of women going for a hike in the woods alone, and that's when something happens. And then there's one of these podcasts where it's like one of these taglines now where don't go in the woods alone. That's like rule number one.
I know the one you're talking about. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so there was recently this thing, I want to get your opinion on this. There's recently this popular kind of question going around on social media that was being asked by women, and I think a lot of women who are into true crime were sort of passing it around, and it was basically this. For any woman, if you were in the woods alone, would you rather be met by a man you don't know or a bear? And let's say a grizzly bear. And overwhelmingly, the women said, I would rather come across a bear. What do you think that says? I mean, about just the reality of the situation, based on, and you've seen a lot of this, what do you think that says, and what do you think that's a cry for? And you know, and I think your book addresses a lot of this, so I think you would be a great person to ask on this. What is going on there? Because that is a staggering statement.
Well, okay, a couple sad reality of it. First of all, when you work in this profession, you realize that any discussion that there is no distinction between men and women biologically or just the way we're wired, or what our biochemistry drives us to do, is simply false, because you know that the percentage of criminals. Look at your state prison population for men and compare it to your state prison population for women. The number of men who commit violent crimes is so much more dramatic. And there's people who have said, okay, why is it that the true crime audience is dominantly female? Yeah. It's dominantly female. That networks like Oxygen, which used to have all women, mostly programming was designed for women, ends up being a true crime channel at some point. Well, why is that happening? And you're right. I mean, I read one author who wrote about this, who was a woman, who said that she thought it is about these are cautionary tales, how not to get hurt. And you just said it. So why? Why is there no group of men who are huddling around the television, have a group like this trying to figure out how not to get victimized by women? Yeah. Well, there's a biochemistry issue here, a biological issue here, and there's also a level of depravity that nobody wants to admit. That bear is only going to do one thing to you: kill you.
Yeah.
The man may do a number of other things, and that's typically the kinds of crimes that I work. And so of course you'd rather encounter the bear. I get it, because the man's going to kill you in the end anyway. But it's just what's going to happen before that. Yeah. So sadly, now look, we just said something I think that's pretty gross, right? I mean, it's pretty despicable, but it's just the nature of this is, look, if you're going to work these kinds of crimes, you don't assume the best in people. No one's ever going to go to jail if you assume the best in people. You assume the worst in everyone, and then eventually you'll figure out which one of these guys did it. Mm-hmm. And why do you assume the worst? Because this is our depraved, fallen nature. This is just who we are. And you discover it when you're at that moment. And so this is why I have one chapter in this book called The Killer Inside that is really about, are we by nature fallen, or are we by nature good? Are we people who are corrupted by our families and by our environments and by political systems, or are we the corruptors of family, environments, and political systems? Which is it? We got to figure this out. Yeah. And this, by the way, if you're working cold cases, you're working guys who have spent the last 30 years looking spectacular. 30 years in which you would say, that's no way that guy did a murder that didn't kill his wife 30 years ago. Yeah. He's been married for the last 29 years, and he's been spectacular. His wife loves him, got a great family. There's no way he could have done that. Well, that's because that's the enigma of man. That's who we are, is that we can be both of these things simultaneously. And I think the Christian worldview explains this brilliantly. So the question then becomes, so that's why I think this is one of those fields where two things emerge. Number one, when push comes to shove, we are objective truth believers. We can say that the culture has moved toward relativism, but not in courtrooms. In courtrooms, people have no problem. So far, I haven't seen it. I've not even seen a problem in paneling juries where it's like, wow, do they really? No, they're going to make an inference that this actually happened, whether I like it or not, whether I think it should have happened or not, whether it fits my form of what my my lived experience is or not. They're going to stick with this objective reality occurred in the past related to this crime based on that evidence. So that's one thing you see emerge. The other thing you see is that our true understanding of the difference between men and women emerges in these murders. Because it turns out that we know typically that we're looking, even if it's a guy who's dead in the bed and we suspect his wife, we're probably going to find out that she's got a boyfriend who did this, got another guy. So in the end, even if she's the one who set it up, she's the one you could say really is the killer because she's behind all of this. Probably no, it does happen, but I think we recognize, if nothing else, that you don't go in the woods alone because you're the biological inferior. I don't say mean like you're inferior, but you're the weaker of the two sexes, and that's why you would think, well, but also because they're the weaker of the two sexes, they are often the target of crimes, all kinds of crimes. And you might not be, because you're so it's very different. So in the end, this is one of those areas of work that kind of it cuts right back to what's true about people. We could wish the world was a different way. We could wish there was a different spectrum and biological spectrum between this binary spectrum of men and women. We could wish for that if you want to. That's great. But the reality is these kinds of worlds, most cops know better. Because we're stuck in the real world where real passions flare, where real patience runs out, where what happens is you're not quite sure what's in that mug, right? The surest way to figure out what's in the mug is to punch it, to tip it, to nudge it, and these are the moments where people are nudged, and we get to see what's really in there. And so it does reveal some things. Now, what's great about it is that then if you're a cop, you've probably had these discussions with your own kids. Don't do this, don't do that. Think about this. That's not safe. Da, 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 da. And if you're the daughter or son of a cop, you probably have thought, man, my childhood was much different than my friends because I could never do anything. Well, it's because your father or your mother, who was a police officer, saw things that he or she could say, yeah, that's not a good idea. That's what this book's all about. Not things that aren't a good idea, Yeah,
I was going to say, as the son of a firefighter, I can definitely tell you that. I've driven people crazy before with my knowledge of all the things that can burn and destroy you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Unplugging things and all. So you are raised in a different way where you're just more, you grow up a little quicker, I guess.
I remember. My mom raised me alone, and she was very, very politically liberal. And she got divorced in 1964, never remarried. So I was raised in the 60s and 70s by this single mom who was very self-sufficient, took care of everything on her own, very caring of other people. We were pretty poor growing up, so she had a real heart for other people who were living on their tips and living on just trying their best, as waitresses, or she got hair for a living. So she, as a hairdresser, we didn't, it was tough, but she was very, very compassionate, kind of soft with the people. My dad, I remember, when he was a cop, I was born in his academy. So by the time I was 10, I remember thinking, this guy's a bit of a jerk. Now, he didn't raise me. They were separate. They were divorced. So I would just see my dad occasionally. And every time I'd see him, I would just see this kind of innate pessimism he had toward people. And I just thought, wow, no wonder no wonder this didn't work out. They're so different. Well, then I realized after I became a cop, I was like, oh, no, I think I see what he saw. I get it. In other words, that pessimism about people comes from being exposed to the kinds of cases we're exposed to repeatedly, where it starts to get into your head. In other words, if I go to your neighborhood, Derek, and 2 doors down from your house, a house that looks just like your house, I get called for a domestic violence, and I get in there, and it's like, what a mess. The stuff that's happening behind closed doors is like, oh, what a mess. And then next week, I get, next block over, I go to another call. It doesn't take long for that to start you thinking, is every house like this? Like is this all of us? And for a lot of cops who don't have a biblical worldview, they start to lose confidence that that there's anything positive to point toward. That they think that everyone is they basically think, driving down this street, I could get called to any of these houses because behind those closed doors are the same kind of train wreck over and over and over again, just a different set of names. And that's the problem with this kind of job. And the people we are counseling are sometimes on the job 20 years before they come to us, when their marriages are really struggling. And a lot of that comes from two things: the hypervigilance that cops have to have, constantly driving around on the lookout for how they're going to get killed, and two, the kinds of crimes we have to constantly investigate. But that messes with your head. There's a point at which, if you don't possess a biblical worldview and learn about like the 15 attributes I talk about in this book, you will not come out the other side looking very, very well. And I have a lot of friends who retired and moved to Montana and Wyoming and bought properties with big gates and big fences, and they basically compounded themselves someplace because they started to lose confidence in humanity. And so, this is where I think a biblical worldview can change things.